there's a difference of scientific opinion about whether the second dose should be extended past the date set in the trials. I think that's 21 days for Pfizer and 28 for Moderna. I know BC said that they could extend that up to 35 days. I'm interested in just knowing in some more detail about the thinking around this decision, how the risks in the delay were weighed against inoculating more people.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things here, and it is something that us in people who work with vaccinations, immunizations, are very familiar with this type of dosing and programs, and there are minimum intervals between doses, and then there are very rarely maximum intervals before you have to restart a series, as it were. So this is a 2-dose series, and we are committed as we have said repeatedly, to everybody getting their second dose. What we do know, with the limited supply that we have, and looking at the data that has come out of the clinical trials, both for Pfizer and Moderna, and we've looked at that data in some detail in our clinical and immunization experts at the BC CDC, and we have a BC Immunization Committee who looks at that, as well as the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, who looks at those clinical trials and the raw data from those trials in detail. And what that data shows for both Moderna and Pfizer is that 2 weeks after the first dose, the protection is very, very high in the 85 to 90% range. And then the second dose, within a week of the second dose, that goes up to the 95%. So it tells us that once your body has developed an immune response, you have very high protective levels. And these are amazing protecting levels. When we look at the levels we get from influenza immunization, for example, they're around 70%, and we would have been happy with that. But to have these very high protection levels very early on with these vaccines, it really proves to us that these new platforms for delivering an immune response to the body work well. And so what we have looked at also from the trials is the time periods that people were given the vaccine in the trials. And for the Pfizer and Moderna, for the Pfizer in particular, the outside edge was, I think, 48 days. And there was no diminution in protection in that period of time. In the Moderna, it was very similar. It was actually a little bit longer. I think it was up to somewhere in the 50 or 60 days after the first dose. So the manufacturer, when they provide the information to Health Canada and the details, they have a recommended dose interval. And their recommended dose interval is 21 to 28 days for Pfizer. So Pfizer had initially said 21 days. Moderna was 28 days, was their recommended ideal time frame. But they've adjusted so that it can be aligned, recognizing that complexity of systems make it challenging. So both of them said somewhere around 28 days. Moderna, it was actually up to 35 days. Anyway, that there is a range that is safe for using these vaccines, and that has been upheld by the UK vaccine expert committee as well as NACI. So there is a minimum interval. If you give it too soon, it doesn't have that boosting effect that you want to have. The other thing that we know from immunology is that if you delay a dose, for most vaccines, that gives you a stronger and longer lasting effect. We don't know that. There is no data for that for these vaccines because the studies were done to try and finish them as soon as possible. So they had a minimum interval between the two doses being given. But there's a very real probability that there will be confer a benefit from slight delays in the second dose. That is under investigation both here in the monitoring we're doing in the UK and elsewhere. So the bottom line is, what we have done is we have an emergency operations center structure that Dr. Ross Brown and myself are part of, are running. And we have a process where all of the scientific information is pulled together from our immunization committee, and then a recommendation is made, and we look at the operational issues. So as you know, the vaccine that we're receiving through the federal government is back-end loaded. We are getting small amounts of doses in the first few weeks, and then more as we go into February and March. So that meant that we would have to keep doses in fridges if we went with a strict 21 days. And there is the balance of evidence that we have on being able to protect people, the very high short-term protection that we get from the first dose after 2 weeks, and the fact that we were getting more vaccine to be able to give second doses within a reasonable time frame that was in the trials. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying we did an ethical review, we looked at the data, we looked at the modeling of how many people we could best protect, and we looked at the operational issues of how much vaccine we're expecting to get at what time. And we made the decision that we would look at 35 days as being the standard. And if we get vaccine as expected, people who received their doses in December and January will receive dose 2 around 35 days from their initial shot. And we absolutely, the science bears out that this is a reasonable approach that maximizes our ability to protect more people during the most infectious and period where we have the highest rates of transmission. So it is a balancing, but we absolutely did an ethical review, and that decision was made with all of those pieces of information in mind.
Gordon, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I do. How do you expect this policy in place throughout the vaccine rollout, like to the end of the year or to the fall? And will it be extended to all vaccines? You mentioned that there are obviously others that are in trial right now.
It will really depend. It will be for the first few months, given what we know about vaccine supply. If we get a lot more supply, then we absolutely will try and do it on the optimal schedule. So we will also be very much evaluating this as we go. If there's any signal that people are not getting the protection they need because we're delaying by a week their second dose, then we will change that. So that's really important that we do monitor these things. As well, around the world, we're monitoring, how long does this protection last? And we don't know the answers to those things yet. So in some places, the UK is looking at, the level of protection people are getting out to 12 weeks. We know that some people who don't come back for their second dose, and we can tell if they've ended up with infection. So these are ways of helping us understand. We'll be looking at whether one dose is sufficient, and that's something that the company is looking at. We are, as I said, committed to doing a 2-dose program here in BC, and the minimal delay that we're talking about for the first couple of months is well within the safety parameters and effectiveness parameters. So it'll depend on what we learn about these vaccines in the coming months. It will also depend the new vaccines that we have. Some of them are single-dose vaccines programs, and the Janssen or the Johnson & Johnson one in particular is their clinical trial says 3 arms. One of the arms is a single dose. So it'll be great if that worked. And there's some really good data that the UK has from AstraZeneca that showed that the people who got the doses later, so missed for operational reasons, didn't get their second dose until 8, 9, or 10 weeks, actually had better protection overall. So that's intriguing, and we need to learn more about that.
Dr. Henry, this question is also connected to administering the second dose of the vaccine. What do you say to healthcare workers who gave informed consent to receiving that second dose 21 to 28 days after getting the first dose, and they now say they feel as though they've been misled? Should they be able to receive that the second dose that they had agreed to in that time frame before the policy changed? Should they have that option?
So the policy was in play from the beginning, and what people consented to was a 2-dose series with the expectation or the recommendation is that it would be around 21 to 28 days. And we have this with all of our immunization programs, that there's sometimes operational reasons where things have to be moved from one, slightly. And this is well within the safety parameters that we know from the data. I didn't mention, but, the WHO has come out and said within 42 days is a recommendation from WHO looking at the same data. So this is not about misleading people. It's about consenting to to a 2-dose series, which we are committed to, and the operational issues of making sure that we can maximize the protection for those who need it and make sure we can give that second dose in a safe time frame, given the operational considerations and the amount of vaccine that we're getting.
Tanya, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, please. And if we could get an answer on this in French as well from Minister Dix, please. We currently don't see teachers and firefighters listed on BC's vaccine priority groups. Both groups have been lobbying to be included higher up in the rollout plan. So is the province considering prioritizing those groups?
So right now, our priorities, as you've seen, deal with with the vaccine that we think we're going to get in Q1, and the people that we can immunize with that vaccine that we're scheduled to get. And that is the focus of that we've seen, which is long-term care, critical healthcare workers, key at-risk isolated and remote communities, particularly First Nations communities, and people in the community over age 80. So those are what we're focusing on from now to March. After March, we are expecting to get more vaccines, different vaccines, and more volume of vaccines. And we have not yet put out our strategy for the second quarter and into the summer and fall of 2021. There's discussions going on at the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations around practicalities and how we do this. And believe me, it's not just firefighters, it's veterinarians, it's poultry workers, it's there's a whole host of people, teachers, of course, childcare. There's many people in our community who need to be immunized and want to be immunized. And our strategy is going to be, how can we get as much vaccine as we are able to get into as many arms as we can. And with more details of that will follow. Everybody is still included on that list. We are not prioritizing people. We're going to be working through this collectively across the country in the next few weeks, and we will we'll be giving more details. I do want to say two other things, as I've heard some concerns as well expressed from people who are pregnant or breastfeeding, and we do have guidance for people where the recommendation from the National Advisory Committee that we have taken here in BC is that it's an individual choice based on your own risk assessment. So a pregnant healthcare worker or a breastfeeding healthcare worker who works in an ICU may choose to take the vaccine over the risk that they may have from COVID. And we have some detailed information on the BC CDC website for clinicians, because that is a discussion that a person has to have with their physician about their own personal risk benefit. And the same goes for people who are immune compromised. As we know, the two vaccines that we have right now are not recommended for people who have immune compromising conditions, and those are very specific. And so it is not, it's not everybody. It's some autoimmune disorders, but it's mostly focused on, and some people who are on immune suppressing medications at very high levels, and it's also for people who are taking some types of cancer treatment, for example. Right now, as well, in BC, these vaccines are not recommended, but again, it's because they have not been studied, so we don't know if people will mount an immune response. And again, it comes down to a personal risk assessment. So people who are undergoing cancer therapy need to talk to their clinician about the risk benefit of receiving the vaccine. So those are all things that are really important. We have not forgotten people who are immune compromised, and we will be, as the evidence and the data comes about different vaccines and new vaccines, and we learn more about the two we have, we'll be updating those as well.